Welcome to a journey where steel clashes, blood stains the earth, and honor is carved not just with swords, but with the very lives of warriors. If you've got a drink of your choice handy, whether it's strong coffee to brace yourself or something a bit stiffer to match the mood, settle in tight. We're diving head first into the brutal demands of ancient warfare, where the line between glory and death was not just thin, it was often non-existent. Picture this: the crack of dawn, a sky bruised with ominous clouds, warriors stretching tired limbs, gripping weapons that would soon taste flesh and bone. This wasn't a staged duel on a chessboard-like battlefield with referees blowing whistles. No, this was raw, unforgiving chaos, controlled only by the discipline of those who had no choice but to accept death as part of the job description. You think modern combat is tough? Imagine facing down an enemy not just with superior steel, but with a code of honor so ruthless it demanded you might as well be already dead. Ancient warfare was a brutal masterpiece of necessity and spectacle. The sword, for instance, it wasn't just a tool or symbol, it was the very extension of a warrior's will, sometimes affectionately nicknamed and carried as if it were a beloved pet. These blades were deadly, yes, but heavy with history. The Roman gladius was a compact stabbing machine made for close quarters, turning cramped ship decks and narrow city streets into death traps. The samurai katana, a slice of art and lethality forged through countless hours of tempering steel and sharpening pride. Both blades whispered the same grim truth: your life was only as long as your swing was true. Speaking of ship decks, we can't forget the galleys of antiquity, those long, narrow vessels powered by oarsmen who probably would have given anything to not be there. These weren't leisure cruises, they were floating death machines. Imagine dozens of men, cramped like sardines, sweat mixing with salty spray, rowing to the rhythm of war cries and clangs of metal. Battles were fought not just with arrows and catapults, but with boarding parties, swinging swords, clubs, and whatever else could be found. If you survived the crashing waves and enemy missiles, you fought in hand-to-hand combat that made the most brutal bar fight look like a politeness contest. Victory meant dominance, but defeat often landed you in the hole's depths, either drowned or drowning in your own blood. Now, if you think the worst ugliness of ancient warfare was just about surviving enemy swords or the madness of battle, think again. Many warriors lived and died bound by codes so strict they'd make modern military drill sergeants look like slackers. Consider the samurai tradition of seppuku, a ritual suicide that combined deadly ceremony with personal accountability. If a samurai failed his lord or brought shame upon himself, honor dictated he performed this grisly self-sacrifice rather than face capture or disgrace. Yes, this wasn't your garden variety, I'm feeling down, might text an ex moment. This was a public, meticulous act involving a short blade and a stomach that wasn't going to cooperate. It sounds brutal because it absolutely was, and it highlights the intense pressure ancient warriors carried every day. Life in the field wasn't just about beating your enemy, but also about living and dying by a strict code that defined your very essence. And those codes weren't limited to samurai alone. In the ancient world, from the Spartans who trained since birth to die on the phalanx, to the Viking berserkers who embraced frenzy with a grin and a battle axe, honor was a currency often purchased with a lifetime or less of suffering. Battles were performance and sacrifice rolled into one, where personal valor sometimes mattered more than strategic sense. After all, what good was winning if you couldn't hold your ground as a warrior of rigid discipline? It's easy to romanticize the age of swords and shields, imagining noble knights and fearless heroes. But strip away the shiny armor and grand mythology, and what you find is a grinding, blood-soaked world where survival odds were slim and dying well was as important as winning. In ancient warfare, the demands were relentless. You had to be a killer and a servant to your code, a craftsman in wielding weapons, and a master of facing death with a cold, unwavering stare. So the next time you see a movie fight scene or hear tales of honor-bound warriors, remember the harsh reality beneath the legend. Ancient warfare wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a crucible where civilizations were forged in fire, metal, and the unbreakable will of those who dared to wager it. The sword, the galley, the knife turning in the warrior's own hand, each element tells the story of a world where brutality met honor head on, shaping history with every deadly encounter. This was no game. This was survival. This was ancient war. Imagine holding in your hand the very weapon that once defined kings and warriors, the sword, a seemingly simple piece of metal, yet one that carried the weight of life, death, honor, and power across millennia. Long before the flash of gunpowder and the thunder of cannons, the sword was the ultimate currency of war, prestige, and survival. But how did this gleaming instrument of destruction evolve from a crude blade hammered from bronze into the razor-sharp symbol of dominion we recognize today? The story begins deep in the smoky crucibles of the Bronze Age. Bronze may sound like something your grandma collects at a flea market, but 3,000 years ago, it was the cutting edge, literally. When ancient metallurgists first discovered the magic mix of copper and tin, suddenly they had a metal hard and durable enough to carve, slash, and stab through the chaos of battlefields. Early swords were short, heavy clubs with sharp edges, not the elegant sabers or rapiers you picture in Hollywood films. These bronze blades were as much status symbols as weapons. To wield one was to broadcast, "I'm somebody," and not just a somebody, but probably someone with access to rare materials, skilled smiths, and a roaring ego. But bronze had its limits. It was brittle, susceptible to cracking, and demanded careful maintenance. Enter iron, the sneaky hero of the battlefield. The transition from bronze to iron weaponry wasn't overnight. It was a slow, messy revolution fueled by trial, error, and a fair bit of smelting wizardry. Imagine trying to melt rocks while surrounded by enemies. Gotta admire their multitasking. By around 1200 BCE, iron began forging its way across the Old World, and with it came longer, sharper, and deadlier swords that could slice through armor and bone with newfound efficiency. This metallurgical leap transformed not only the sword, but the very nature of warfare. No longer were kings content to hide behind walls and archers. Now, the sword demanded face-to-face confrontation. A warrior's skill with the blade could turn the tide of entire battles. Suddenly, strategy had a new variable: the personal combat prowess of champion swordsmen. Battles became as much about duels and bravery as military formations. Swordsmanship was a language written in steel. But the sword wasn't just about the war zone. It permeated society. Across ancient societies, from the chariot-riding Hittites to the phalanx-locked Greeks and the sword-wielding Celts, the blade was a status symbol, a badge of honor, and often a key to one's identity. Chiefs and nobles carried swords ornately decorated with gold, gems, and intricate engravings. These weren't just tools. They were art, poetry, and blunt instruments of social order, all rolled into one. Take the Greek xiphos, that classic short sword you've probably seen in every Spartacus film ever made. Compact, double-edged, and designed for close combat, it was more than a weapon. It was a rite of passage. Every hoplite, Greek foot soldier, carried one. But not all blades were equal. A finely crafted xiphos could last through countless battles. A cheap knuckler would shatter the first time it met iron. Owning a good sword could mean the difference between glorious survival and being just another corpse on the dusty plains of Marathon or Thermopylae. Meanwhile, in the East, the evolution was equally fascinating. The pugnacious samurai of ancient Japan didn't just own any old sword. The katana was a work of ritualized perfection. Folded thousands of times, polished to mirror shine, the katana was both a killing machine and an extension of the warrior soul. But it wasn't always that way. Early Japanese swords were straight and heavy like their Chinese counterparts, primarily used by cavalry. Over time, the gradual curve emerged, giving the blade razor-like slicing power, a design so effective it's held up through centuries, influencing swordsmiths worldwide. What's remarkable is how swords didn't merely shape practical strategy, but also the cultural code of warriors. They carved the framework of honor, sacrifice, and even death itself. Consider the grim practice of seppuku, ritual suicide with one's own blade. The sword here was not just a tool of war, but an instrument of redemption, the final, personal act of a warrior reclaiming his honor amidst defeat or disgrace. It's brutal, it's raw, and it shows just how deeply the sword was embedded in the concept of identity and morality. Moving west, the Celtic swords tell a slightly wilder tale. Unlike the tight formations of Greece or the methodical discipline of Rome, many Celtic warriors thrived on individual ferocity and showmanship. Their swords were often shorter, broad, and designed for slashing, sometimes elaborately decorated with swirling patterns and symbols that some scholars think invoked supernatural protection on the battlefield. Yet these weren't mere trinkets. They were practical tools for the chaotic, fast-paced clashes where every slash could spell survival or death. Speaking of death, the sword's symbolic role as the harbinger of mortality stretches beyond personal combat to grand strategy. The introduction of domed or segmented armor across ancient armies pressured sword makers to innovate. A gladiator's sharp dagger might be useless against scale armor, while the Roman gladius, short, stout, and designed for close-quarter stabbing, excelled at exploiting gaps and enemy defense. This constant tug-of-war between offense and defense spurred a technological arms race centuries before the term existed. But there's an often overlooked aspect to ancient swords, how they influenced politics and social order. Owning a certain kind of sword, or even a sword at all, could legitimize leaders or entire dynasties. In many cultures, swords were cast in ceremonies, blessed by priests or shaman, and passed down through lineages like necklaces or crown jewels. The sword was a symbol that said, "I hold power, not just because I can take life, but because I'm chosen or worthy." If you were swordless, good luck walking the halls of power without tripping. In some ways, the sword was the ancient world's version of a luxury car. Status, elegance, and functional brutality all in one package. Kings weren't content with bland weapons. They commissioned blades with exquisite craftsmanship, unique patterns formed by folding metals, and hilts studded with gems and carved with mythological imagery. These swords were trophies as much as weapons, designed to be flaunted as they were wielded. And yet, no matter how beautiful or prestigious, the sword always retained its blunt truth. It was a tool of survival in a violent world. Its sharpness saved lives, but just as easily ended them. It was a language of power writ large across societies, a phrase shouted in steel upon battlefield and throne alike. By tracing the sword from bronze beginnings to iron mastery, we see more than metallurgy. We witness the shaping of civilizations. Strategies evolved, statuses crystallized, and identities forged in the flicker of a blade's glint. Every sword's edge was a line between life and death, power and submission, glory and oblivion. So next time you see a sword in a museum or a movie, remember, it wasn't just a weapon. It was the ancient world's social network, its political manifesto, and its harshest judge, all wrapped in feel. Imagine the restless sea under a blistering sun, the salty spray stinging your face, and the rhythmic splash of hundreds of oars cutting through churning waves, each stroke a heartbeat in the grim symphony of ancient naval warfare. Long before aircraft carriers and missile cruisers, war was waged on floating platforms of wood and muscle. These ships, far from the leisurely tourist boats we know today, were lethal machines of war, demanding an endurance and coordination from their crews that would make a modern-day endurance athlete weep. And that's before you factor in the threat of enemy ramming, fire, or boarding. Let's set sail into the world of war galleys, those ancient vessels where rowing wasn't just exercise, but life or death. Take the Mediterranean trireme, for example. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it was the battleship of the classical era. Imagine a vessel about 120 feet long, narrow, and built to skim the water like a prodigy surfer chasing the perfect wave. 3 rows of oarsmen stacked vertically on each side, sometimes up to 170 rowers packed in, calves screaming and backs burning, working in near-perfect synchrony. Coordination was everything. One misplaced stroke could spell disaster, either capsizing the ship or doomfully slowing it down, leaving the vessel an easy target for the enemy. But why all the fuss about oars? Because unlike later sailing ships, these galleys relied heavily on human power rather than the mercy of the wind. The trireme's maneuverability came from hundreds of arms pulling in unison. That's right, not a machine, not an engine, just human willpower transformed into devastating speed and agility. What's more, these rowers weren't leisurely nobles sipping wine as some might imagine. Most were free citizens, sometimes slaves or prisoners, thrust into brutal endurance contests every time battle loomed. Their bodies had to withstand the constant strain, the cramped conditions below deck, and the ever-present threat of enemy arrows or flaming projectiles raining down. And if the enemy managed to ram your ship, the sudden jolt could fling you overboard or pulverize the fragile hull. Then it was a desperate scramble. Either fight as the ship boarded, jump into shark-infested waters, or drown with your oars clenched tight in defiance. The offensive capability of these triremes relied heavily on the infamous ram, a bronze-covered beak jutting from the bow designed to pierce enemy hulls like a spear through paper. Each naval engagement often boiled down to a deadly game of chicken. Who would ram whom first? And not just once, but repeatedly, circling, crushing, and sinking. The crews were essentially floating battering rams with a human engine inside. Shift your gaze northward, and a very different naval warship takes shape, the Viking longship. It might not impress you with triple rows of oars, but don't underestimate its cunning. These longships were slender, shallow draft vessels powered by a single row of oars on each side, but endowed with remarkable versatility. Capable of sliding up shallow rivers or sneaking into hidden fjords, they made the Vikings the terror of medieval Europe's shores. Rowers in these longships were often warriors themselves. There was no room for slackers in these cramped vessels, where the same hands that pulled an oar also gripped a sword or axe moments later. The endurance requirements were astronomical. Imagine hours, sometimes days of rowing against tide and wind in freezing temperatures, with minimal food, on deck slick with sweat and sea spray. Their code wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving conditions that would have shattered lesser men. And surviving wasn't just a matter of physical prowess, but mental toughness. Consider the discipline on board a longship: silent when necessary, responsive to commands, and utterly ruthless. Viking crews didn't row for glory alone. They rowed to raid, to pillage, to conquer. Every stroke carried the weight of impending violence. Coordination under these conditions was no joke. Just as in the Mediterranean, a single misstep could cause a disastrous capsize or give the enemy an opening. But without a raised deck or protective superstructure, Viking rowers were often exposed to the elements and enemy arrows. The disadvantage? The visible oxygen tanks for invincible warriors. Human rowers, their lives on the line every time the vessel pushed off the shore. Even when at rest, these galleys demanded sacrifice. Crews slept in cramped quarters, sometimes near supplies of grease and tar that could ignite in a heartbeat. Scurvy grape and salt pork were staples, steering their health toward collapse over long campaigns. And if battle reached the point of boarding, the same men who spent all day or night pulling oars had to shoulder heavy weapons, scrap for every inch, and often face brutal melee combat. These vessels were more than ships. They were floating microcosms of ancient warfare's harsh demands. Sailors had to be athletes, tacticians, and warriors simultaneously. The physical agony of rowing, the strategic dance of naval engagement, all combined with the psychological terror of being trapped on an object barely buoyant in hostile waters surrounded by hungry enemies. It's tempting to romanticize the imagery of galley warfare, the roar of battle, the clash of bronze and steel, the spray of the sea. But behind this glory was relentless grueling labor, high casualty rates, and a constant dance with death. Human endurance was weaponized, every sinew strained, every breath measured, every second a gamble on survival. In a sense, war galleys demanded a level of brutal equipoise between man and machine, men turned into engines and machines forged for men, a relentless cycle of destruction and resilience that shaped naval warfare for centuries. The Mediterranean's shimmering blue waters bore witness to clashes where hundreds of rowers pulled together as if synchronized by the gods themselves, while the dark northern seas heard the pounding of Viking oar blades, heralding raids that would change Europe forever. So the next time you imagine ancient warships, don't picture elegant wooden yachts bobbing lazily in the harbor. Think instead of furious, screaming crews, hungering and gasping under blinding sun or freezing rain, muscles burning as they propel these deadly vessels, floating instruments of war and sacrifice across unforgiving seas to face death and glory on the waves. Their stories are carved not just in history, but in the sinews of endurance, in the raw, brutal demands of ancient naval warfare. Imagine living in a world where your entire identity, your honor, and even your fate hinged not merely on brute strength or clever strategy, but on a rigid, often merciless code of conduct. Warriors didn't just fight enemies, they battled the expectations of their own culture's unforgiving standards. From the dust-choked battlefields of ancient Sparta to the misty mountains of feudal Japan, the demands placed on those bearing swords and shields weren't just brutal, they were existential. Take the Spartans, for instance. If you thought their reputation as fierce fighters came simply from tough training and the fear they inspired, think again. Spartan discipline was less about building muscle and more about forging a brutal, relentless mindset that brooked no weakness or compromise. From childhood, boys were ripped from their families to live in the agogay, a state-sponsored crucible that beat fear, pain, and individuality into submission. Weakness was a death sentence, not just literally, but socially, because any hint of cowardice threatened the precarious balance of their military society. When a Spartan warrior marched to war, he carried more than a spear and a shield. He carried the weight of a brutal code, insisting he must either return victorious or not at all. Retreat was betrayal, surrender unthinkable, and to go home without your shield, a metaphorical and literal symbol of courage, was to invite death by your own people. You can almost hear the echoes of Spartan mothers' infamous command, "Come back with your shield or on it." Imagine the psychological pressure on every soldier, forced to balance survival instincts against such public expectations. The battlefield wasn't just a place of physical danger. It was a gladiatorial stage where courage was currency, and failure meant social execution far grimmer than any spear wound. Now shift your gaze across continents and centuries to the samurai of Japan. While Spartans demanded unquestioning obedience and communal sacrifice, samurai were tethered to the ancient, intricate Bushido code, an ethical construct blending loyalty, honor, and personal rectitude into a deadly cocktail of expectations. For the samurai, fighting well was important, sure, but how a warrior faced death and dishonor was often more important. The practice of seppuku, or ritual suicide, might strike modern sensibilities as extreme, even barbaric. But for samurai, it was a grim act of preserving honor in the face of failure. Picture this: a samurai, having possibly lost a battle or offended his lord, sits calmly with a short blade ready, surrounded by witnesses. The act is not a desperate cry, but a solemn, almost sacred ceremony of self-redemption. It was an all-or-nothing gamble that into a final assertion of control and virtue. In a world where disgrace could irrevocably tarnish your family name, this brutal expectation wasn't a punishment. It was a perverse kind of dignity. In feudal Japan, the refusal to meet these demands was to live forever shamed. The acceptance was a kind of brutal freedom. It's hard to imagine anything less romantic, and yet these rituals shaped the very fabric of samurai society. Both the Spartans and samurai also shared a fascination with the spectacle of death, the necessity to meet it on one's own terms. And death itself wasn't just an endpoint, it was a harsh negotiation conducted under the glare of societal scrutiny. Warrior codes dictated how to behave in victory and defeat alike, leaving little room for personal mercy or mercy's shadow. For the Spartans, the battlefield was a stage where only absolute valor counted. For the samurai, it was an arena where honor created meaning out of bloodshed. In Europe, too, the notion of honor was no less unforgiving. The medieval knight might not have had a state-mandated agoge or the ritualized seppuku, but the chivalric code brought its own iron discipline. Knights were expected to be paragons of loyalty and virtue, but also bound by sometimes contradictory rules, from protecting the weak to engaging in deadly jousts for no purpose but glory. And failure, whether through capture or cowardice, often brought lifelong disgrace, that could haunt families for generations. Knights knew well that their reputations were as much weapons as their swords. These strict codes often forced warriors into decisions that today might seem painfully irrational or cruel. Imagine a soldier choosing death over surrender, or a leader sacrificing thousands of his own men for the abstraction of honor or national pride. How does one weigh survival against such monumental expectations? History offers no shortage of examples where these brutal demands trumped empathy or tactical pragmatism, showing how the ancient warrior was as much a prisoner of cultural scripts as he was a master of battle. Of course, these savage rules also shaped everything beyond the battlefield. They dictated social relationships, political alliances, and even family structures. From many cultures, the warrior code wasn't just military discipline, it was the blueprint for life itself. In Sparta, the military discipline fostered a society where individuality was suppressed in favor of unity, excluding women from the political sphere while demanding total conformity from men. The samurai code tied personal loyalty so tightly to feudal lords that betrayal was not only personal treason, but a cosmological crime against the social order. Even in the smallest details, these codes powered decisions that seem alien now. For instance, Spartan warriors who bore the scars of wounds were celebrated like badges of honor, while in some samurai traditions, visible injuries laid bare failure to protect oneself properly. There were unwritten rules about who could die, how, when, and where, nuances that could tilt the balance between honor and shame with terrifying finality. Were these brutal codes the backbone of ancient military success, or the cruel shackles that ensured endless cycles of violence and tragedy? Probably a bit of both. They turned raw men into legends, forging identities more enduring than any stolen treasure or conquered city. Yet they also demanded merciless sacrifices of freedom, of life, and often of one's very humanity. In understanding these rigid and relentless warrior codes, we glimpse the raw, unvarnished forces that shaped not only battles, but civilizations themselves. We see a world where morality was a sword as sharp as any blade, cutting away doubt and hesitation in the cruel pursuit of honor. And perhaps we also recognize that beneath every warrior's armor beat a human heart weighed down by expectations far heavier than any shield. Imagine standing on the edge of a precipice, both literal and metaphorical, where life and death are as tightly woven as the silk of a kimono, and where honor is carved into flesh with as much precision as a master swordsmith might craft a katana. This is the dark, brutal realm of seppuku in feudal Japan, a practice that seems, at first glance, as baffling and extreme as watching someone willingly choose to smash their favorite TV instead of just turning it off. But peel back the layers of smoke and steel, and it reveals a culture where death was not only inevitable, but a canvas upon which the unforgiving standards of honor and shame were painted in vivid crimson strokes. Seppuku wasn't just suicide. It was a ritual, an art form soaked in blood and tradition that demanded the ultimate proof of a samurai's courage and loyalty. It was the final act in a play where the stakes were life itself, and the consequences of failing the script were unthinkable. This wasn't your average exit strategy. It was, in effect, the ancient Japanese version of hitting the reset button on shame, a morbid reset that was less about escape and more about redemption. But why would anyone choose such a grisly fate? The answer lies deep within the veins of a society that prized honor above all else, often far beyond the value it placed on life. When a samurai's reputation was blackened by disgrace, failure in battle, or political defeat, living with that stain was social death. Real death, then, became a kind of salvation, a way to control your story, your legacy, your very soul. In a world where words like shame and honor carried weight heavier than armor, seppuku was a somber vow made with one's own hand. Picture this: a warrior dressed in pristine white robes, symbolizing purity and readiness to meet death, kneeling on a tatami mat. His loyal second, known as the Kaishaku Nin, stands at his side, ready not only to witness this harrowing act, but to spare him the prolonged agony. The ritual begins with the samurai plunging a tanto, a short blade, into his abdomen, slicing from left to right in a slow, deliberate motion. Blood spills, but the ceremony doesn't end there. It demands not only physical endurance, but mental fortitude, a testament to his steadfastness in the face of ultimate despair. And when the agony becomes unbearable, the Kaishaku Nin plunges his katana to decapitate the samurai, ending the suffering swiftly and with grim dignity. Sounds like a scene from a particularly grim movie, right? But for centuries, this practice was woven deeply into the fabric of samurai culture. It was, paradoxically, both a public act and an intensely personal one, an extreme expression of loyalty, self-control, and sometimes protest. Some samurai chose seppuku to atone for failure. Others used it to avoid capture, refusing to let their enemies claim the triumph of killing or humiliating them. It was as much about control over one's fate, over how one's story would be remembered, as it was about death itself. However, seppuku was not a casual pastime. It adhered to strict codes, almost theatrical in precision, where every gesture echoed centuries of ritualistic practice. There was a certain choreography to it, a measured rhythm in the movement of blade and breath. This ceremony demanded witnesses, and the honor of those attending was tied to the gravity of the event. No wandering peasants or curious onlookers. This was a deeply stratified affair that reinforced the rigid hierarchy of feudal Japan. It was a grim reminder that death, even in its most personal form, was still bound by societal rules. Interestingly, the motivations behind seppuku weren't always straightforward. Sometimes it was demanded by one's lord as a punishment, a harsh sentence for treason or dishonor. Other times, samurai volunteered for it to protest political decisions or betrayals, turning their own death into a statement louder than any battlefield cry. In some cases, high-ranking officials expected it from disgraced retainers, a cold, formal way of cleaning up messes without the messy spectacle of execution. And not all who practiced it were men. Women of samurai families had their own related ritual, jigai, which, while less public, was equally devastating in its symbolism and finality. Seppuku also served as a potent reminder of the ever-present shadow cast by the rigid codes of Bushido, the way of the warrior. These codes weren't just philosophical musings. They were practical, brutal directives. Live with honor or die trying. And if dying, do it on your own terms, with blade in hand and face palm. The shame of failing to meet these standards wasn't just a cultural slap on the wrist. It was a mark worse than death because it corrupted the legacy and stained the bloodline. After all, in a warrior culture where family reputation was everything, tarnish one name and the whole clan's future was at risk. But beneath the stoic veneer and poetic solemnity lay a stark reality. Seppuku was excruciating, bloody, and far from the hero's death that tales sometimes romanticize. The act demanded not only physical endurance, but the iron discipline to look into the void and smile. Refusal or botched attempts could mean disgrace for the samurai's family and a brutal retribution from one's peers. It was a death wrestled from chaos, ordered and ritualized to uphold an ideal that valued image, courage, and control above mercy. The practice eventually faded, especially with the modernization of Japan and the decline of the samurai class. But the legacy of seppuku lingers, an enduring symbol of a society where the line between honor and death was not just thin, but often crossed deliberately, fiercely, and without hesitation. It's a haunting echo of a world where your choices were carved into your flesh, and your death was as much a statement as your life ever was. In the grand tapestry of ancient warfare, seppuku stands out not just as a bizarre footnote, but as a window into a harsh reality where ritualized death was woven inseparably with the code of conduct for warriors. It forces us to consider how cultures deal with concepts like shame, legacy, and the ultimate price of maintaining honor when the battlefield extends beyond the sword, deep into the very soul of society. And if you think about it, Next time you get frustrated because you forgot your phone charger or missed your morning coffee, remember this. Somewhere in Japan's ancient past, a samurai faced a fate far more severe than a dead battery or a bad latte. Choosing death over dishonor, he turned a violent end into the ultimate act of control. Now that's commitment to personal branding. Imagine the savage symphony of ancient battlefields, the clang of iron scraping iron, the sickening thunk of arrowheads finding flesh, and the guttural roars of men locked in brutal embrace. This wasn't some distant, sanitized melee easily digested by modern sensibilities. No, hand-to-hand fighting in antiquity was chaos incarnate, a visceral, grotesque ordeal where survival hinged on sheer ferocity, cunning, and the merciless exploitation of every tactical edge. The clash of armies was not a choreographed dance. It was war stripped down to its rawest, most primal form, a test of nerves, strength, and often just dumb luck. Step into the sandals of a hoplite, a legionary, or a samurai. Picture the sweat soaking your brows beneath the weight of your armor, the roar of thousands around you, blades flashing inches from your face as you grapple with an enemy whose hand might be reaching for your throat or your sword. There's no time for fancy footwork here. Every move is a gamble with life or death. And speaking of death, casualties weren't just numbers lost to history. They were vivid reminders of how unforgiving ancient warfare truly was. Let's not sugarcoat this. The brutal reality of close combat was that it was ugly and unrelenting. Unlike the cinematic sword fights with their balletic twirls and fancy flourishes, real ancient fighting was about efficiency, delivering a killing stroke before your opponent did. Blood was everywhere, puddles forming underfoot, slicking the ground to a treacherous slide. Shields, once pristine and symbolic, became chipped, battered, and occasionally cracked from furious blows. Faces, once bright with hope, now blurred into grimaces of pain or frozen expressions of shock. It was a theater of death underpinned by primal human instincts. But what kept these armies from collapsing into pure chaos? After all, thousands of men all screaming, bleeding, swinging weapons wildly, sounds like a recipe for pandemonium. That's where the cunning and brutal innovation of ancient generals come in, masters of organization and dirty tricks alike. Instead of a chaotic melee, they engineered order within turmoil, turning the battlefield into a controlled inferno where each soldier was a cog in a deadly machine. Take the legendary phalanx formation, for instance. Rows of hoplites bristling with long spears and inch-wide shields formed an almost impenetrable wall, a human tank rolling relentlessly forward. It wasn't just about brute strength or courage, it was tactical brilliance. The typology of the spear, its length, and how it was wielded allowed soldiers to strike enemies before those enemies even reached their front line. The genius was that the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Individual heroes were made by the solidarity of their formation. Or think about the Roman legions, the original science projects in disciplined violence. Instead of massive spear walls, Rome perfected the art of flexibility and adaptation. Soldiers equipped with pilum javelins hurled them to break enemy lines, then shrugged off their lighter shields and engaged with deceptive speed, using galley, short, stabbing swords perfect for the tight quarters of close combat, where wide swings could be more a liability than an asset. Roman training drilled them to execute deadly maneuvers like the testudo, the tortoise formation that turned a dozen shields into a moving fortress of steel, impervious to arrows and missiles, turning ranged attacks, the bane of many armies, into mere annoyances. An often overlooked aspect of this savagery was the cutting edge of battlefield innovation, not just in weapons and formations, but in psychological warfare and logistical cunning. The Greeks, Romans, Persians, Carthaginians, and many others pioneered ruses that made the difference between victory and wholesale slaughter. Camouflage, feigned retreats, surprise night attacks, deceptive encampments. Ancient warfare was intelligence-driven killing as much as brute force. And then there were galleys, the ancient warships that churned seas into battlefields. Unlike the serene cruises we imagine, these vessels were floating engines of death. Rowers grunted in agony under commanders' orders, while archers and marines prepared for that moment when iron rammings smashed holes to splinters. Getting aboard an enemy ship meant hand-to-hand fighting on a slippery, confined deck. There was no room to dance here, and every swing mattered. The combination of naval maneuvering, ramming tactics, and sudden boarding assaults pushed commanders to innovate relentlessly. Punishing sea battles demanded a mix of the quickest decisions with the steadfast will to kill or be killed. Amidst all these horrors, the gruesome casualties were a sobering reality. Wounds were savage and often fatal, not just from the weapons, but from infection or shock in a world without antibiotics. A spectacle of severed limbs, shattered skulls, and bleeding bodies stacked like sordid trophies was common. For many, death on the battlefield wasn't swift or merciful. The aftermath involved scavengers, both animal and human, descending upon the carnage in a grim testament to the cycle of war. Yet, even in death, warriors sought control over fate. Across Germany, Rome, and Japan, there emerged the harsh ritual of seppuku, or other forms of ritual suicide, a way to reclaim honor in a world where capture often meant torture, humiliation, or worse. The command to choose death over dishonor illustrated how ancient warriors grappled not only with physical threats, but the mental and spiritual horrors of war. It was a brutal calculus. What is worse, to die on your own terms or live to face eternal disgrace. The bloody choreography of ancient warfare, therefore, was not just a contest of weapons, but also a clash of cultures, tactics, and survival strategies. Every sword stroke was calculated, every formation drilled to perfection, and every act of violence soaked with a cocktail of fear, hatred, and honor. The genius of ancient generals lay not only in wielding the iron and sharpened wood of their legions, but mastering the unpredictable chaos of human nature itself. So next time you picture ancient warriors locked in fierce combat, remember, beneath that swirling cloud of dust and blood, sharp minds controlled the storm. Deadly innovation wasn't just about new weapons or tactics. It was about managing the brutal reality of war. To kill better, to survive longer, and to turn chaos into a weapon. History doesn't just tell us about battles. It reveals how human ingenuity shaped the very nature of violence, forever changing the art of war. Imagine a young boy, barely 10 years old, tossed into the unforgiving wilderness, tasked with surviving on scraps, dodging enemies and predators, all while his peers feast comfortably back home. This wasn't some dystopian reality show challenge. It was the daily grind of the Spartan agoge, the crucible that forged ancient Greece's fiercest warriors. The Spartan state wasn't about coddling its youth. It demanded toughness in every sense of the word, from the moment a child took his first barefoot step into the back-breaking regimen designed to transform him into a killing machine. In Sparta, bare minimum wasn't good enough. Resilience was currency. Boys were ripped from maternal care at age 7 and thrown into communal barracks where hierarchy was brutal and survival was a matter of cunning and brute force. They trained like machines, programmed to endure pain, hunger, cold, and humiliation. Imagine waking up to a headmaster who gleefully punishes you, not only for failure, but for showing any sign of weakness. A blue bruise, a tear, instant loss of status and respect. Failing to bring home enough game to eat, you're not just hungry, you're punished through starvation. And it gets worse. Deception wasn't just a tactic on the battlefield, but a necessary survival skill during training. Kids learned to steal food to stave off starvation, but if caught, the punishment was severe. The logic? If you can't steal with stealth and cunning, you're unfit for the battlefield. Tough love with a Spartan edge. This relentless training gave birth to men who could endure frost without shivering, wounds without faltering, and pain without complaint. Yet it was as much mental conditioning as physical. Discipline wasn't just shouted orders and physical drills. It was drilled into the psyche. Emotional stoicism was expected. Crying? Forget it. Complaining? Defilement of Spartan honor. The purpose was to strip away individuality and create a collective warrior class utterly loyal to Sparta. capable of standing in phalanx formations with unfaltering cohesion and deadly precision. But Spartan rigor wasn't the only brutal school of war discipline, cooking men into instruments of death. Far to the east, on the mist-wreathed islands of Japan, another warrior ideal took root and flourished: the discipline of the samurai, grounded in the code of Bushido. If the Spartan agoge was about raw endurance and physical dominance, Bushido was a mental fortress of honor, loyalty, and a near spiritual acceptance of death. Unlike the Greek boys thrown to the wolves in their youth, samurai training started early with lessons in calligraphy and poetry, paradoxically cultivating an appreciation for beauty alongside martial skill. This was no contradiction, but a means to perfect the warrior's mind, to balance the sword's edge with the refinement of the pen. Yet under this cultured exterior lay an iron will forged by rigorous physical training. Samurai were expected to master swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, and hand-to-hand combat, each practice ritualized to the point of meditative focus. Bushido was as much about how to face death as it was about how to avoid dishonor. The practice of seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, embodied this grim reality. Rather than suffer defeat or capture and bring shame upon their clan, samurai embraced seppuku as a final expression of autonomy and honor. Imagine the psychological fortitude required to voluntarily plunge a dagger into your own abdomen. It wasn't cowardice, it was the ultimate discipline, a testament that a warrior would rather control his fate than succumb to humiliation. Training for seppuku was more than physical preparation, it was mental steel. The samurai had to overcome their natural instinct for survival to commit the act with dignity and purpose. This grim practice underscored a cultural attitude toward death foreign to most Western warriors, where surrender was often seen as a fate worse than death. In Japan, the line between victory and defeat was drawn not just in battle, but in the will to meet death on your own terms, rather than at the hands of your enemy. Back in Sparta, though, their soldiers also approached death with a peculiar mixture of pragmatism and pride. The famous Spartan warriors, with their crimson cloaks and polished bronze shields, were drilled to return with your shield or on it. In other words, a Spartan either came back victorious or he came back dead, but never defeated. It was a stark mantra that embedded the idea that death without honor was unacceptable, and retreat was tantamount to surrendering your very identity. And yet, Spartan training was not just about preparing soldiers for the battlefield. It was about creating a society where every citizen was a soldier first and foremost. This militarization permeated their culture deeply. Food was rationed thinly to build hunger. Sandals were discarded to toughen feet against rough terrain. Pain was no excuse, but a stepping stone. There was even a practice called krypteia, a shadowy form of state-sanctioned survival training where the most promising youths were sent on secret assignments to stealthily assassinate rebels or enemies within their own Hilat population. Imagine being a teenager tasked with clandestine kills under the noses of enslaved populations, spooky, gritty, and grotesquely pregnant. Similarly, samurai training was equally encompassing but philosophically distinct. Bushido was steeped in Zen Buddhism principles, teaching acceptance of impermanence and cultivating an unshakable calm in the face of chaos. Physical drills were supplemented with meditation and mindfulness, ensuring that a samurai didn't just strike hard, but struck with unwavering precision and clarity of mind. In many ways, the harsh training regimens of these ancient cultures weren't just about making men who could fight. They were about molding a mindset, a psychological armor as vital as any helmet or shield. Because at its core, ancient warfare wasn't just a matter of swords clashing and arrows flying. It was a battle against fear, doubt, and the primal urge to survive at all costs. Warriors had to suppress those instincts and embrace a doctrine of discipline so absolute that the battlefield became their stage, and death their final act of honor. So the next time you picture a Spartan warrior standing rigid in a phalanx, or a samurai calmly drawing his katana beneath cherry blossoms, remember the brutal and often tragic preparation behind that iconic stillness, the relentless forging of body and soul under relentless pressure. It wasn't just training. It was transformation on a scale that would rival any modern boot camp or special ops training, but with stakes far deadlier and consequences far more permanent. From the unyielding Spartan pedagogy to the austere, art-infused discipline of Bushido, these were not men who merely fought wars. They became living embodiments of their culture's unforgiving demands. A sharpened sword in hand, a mind unshakable, and a body conditioned to endure the unbearable. This was the path ancient soldiers walked, a brutal dance of suffering, honor, and survival, not unlike the wars they were destined to wage. Siege warfare in ancient times was a merciless game of attrition, a slow torture engineered to break both bodies and spirits. Imagine standing behind those battered stone walls, day after endless day, the sky a bleak ceiling of smoke and dust, your stomach rumbling louder than the clamor of steel and shouting men. The siege wasn't won with the glorious charge, but rather with the creeping shadow of hunger, disease, and sheer mental exhaustion. It was a battle where time was a weapon, and patience, well, patience was a luxury few could afford. Attackers came loaded with monstrous siege engines, catapults vomiting boulders like angry gods, battering rams pounding relentlessly on gates until wood splintered and iron shrieked. Galleys, those sleek oared warships packed with archers and marines, hovered in the waters, ready to blockade any escape or hope for resupply. But this mechanical thunder belied the darkest parts of siegecraft. The true crunch happened once the walls held, because breaking those walls was one thing. Breaking the defender's will was another beast entirely. For the defenders, every day was a countdown to misery. Food stocks were meticulously rationed, bread blackened by mold, ransomed meat boiled into unrecognizable gruel, and whatever roots or scraps could be scavenged in desperate gambles. Starvation was an equalizer of warriors, nobles, and peasants alike. It made enemies of friends and turned once loyal subjects into potential betrayers. And just when you thought you couldn't feel any weaker, disease would slither through cramped quarters like a freeloading thief. Dysentery, scurvy, and fevers ravaged camps and fortresses with the impartial efficiency of a scythe. Sometimes you can almost hear the madness creeping in. History's records, sprinkled with bitter testimonies, tell of defenders resorting to seppuku, the ritual suicide, rather than face the dishonor of capture or starvation. What better way to say, if I can't win, I won't suffer humiliation by someone else's hand. It was a brutal assertion of control in a situation otherwise defined by helplessness. Meanwhile, attackers weren't exactly sitting on plush cushions either. These armies camped outside the walls endured equally horrendous conditions. Trench foot in muddy encampments, the terror of surprise night sorties by the defenders, and the gnawing uncertainty of how long this siege would drag on before their own leaders lost their nerve or supplies ran dry. Plus the psychological games, the taunts, the tortured prisoners shown off to hearten one side and demoralize the other, the nighttime javelins hurled over the ramparts, turned every moment into a trial of nerves. Disease spared no one. The close quarters of camps and the slow decomposition of unburied bodies made for perfect breeding grounds. Some sieges became little more than giant petri dishes for plague and dysentery. Entire waves of soldiers could disappear not by blade, but by bug. The irony? Often the attackers managed this grim call faster than the defenders inside the walls. Logic being that hunger weakens the body, but filth and contagion could drop an army like a hammer hitting an anvil. And then there were the psychological wounds that never quite healed. Imagine days of eerie silence punctuated by occasional screams, the constant dread of a tunnel breaking through, or the omnipresent threat of betrayal from within. Paranoia thrived. Trust was in short supply. Even when troops rested, sleep brought no real comfort, only nightmares of burning villages and shattered families. The siege weaponized fear, turning men into shadows of themselves, eyes darting at every sound. In some cases, the defenders tried desperately creative tactics. Fire arrows to set siege towers ablaze, sorties to destroy supply lines, or sneaky messages smuggled out via rats or hidden couriers. But every success was fleeting. The walls began to crumble, the stores ran low, and the dark reality loomed: surrender or death. And speaking of surrender, when it finally came, it often meant ritual humiliation or worse. Conquered cities were sometimes razed to the ground, their inhabitants slaughtered, sold into slavery, or forced into humiliating ceremonies to mark their defeat. Victory was Pyrrhic, because both sides paid dearly in lives, sanity, and shattered communities. Across the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and the plains of Asia, siege warfare shaped empires and altered the course of history. Those towering walls and keening battle cries weren't just about territorial gain. They echoed the sheer, unforgiving will of men faced with the primal demands of survival under impossible conditions. It was a savage chess match, played with blood, sweat, and broken bones. The siege was both a test and a torment, where warriors were worn down like ancient armor, hammered repeatedly until they gave way, not always to enemy blades, but often to hunger, sickness, and despair. So next time you picture knights in shining armor or warships charging across the waves, remember, behind those heroic images lay a brutal reality, a slow, grinding nightmare where every ration, every breath, every fleeting hope could mean the difference between life and death. The siege was warfare stripped bare, pure and raw, a grim reminder that some battles aren't won in moments of glory, but in the long, dark drag of survival. The ancient battlefield was never just a clash of iron and muscle. It was also a stage where the gods danced, where omens whispered secrets, and where every sword stroke carried the weight of divine judgment. Warriors and commanders didn't march into combat with mere strategy and courage. They carried with them the heavy burden of pleasing unseen forces, interpreting cryptic signs, and battling not just flesh and blood, but fate itself. Imagine a Roman general standing under the early dawn, eyes trained on the flight of birds. This wasn't some casual bird-watching session. This was a high-stakes game of celestial charades. The Romans, inheritors of a stiff upper-lip culture backed by fierce discipline, approached augury with a kind of grim seriousness that would put modern bureaucrats to shame. If the birds flew right, it was a green light from Jupiter himself. If they flew left, or, horror of horrors, not at all, well, better start writing your last will. Consulting the augurs wasn't superstition, it was strategic madness made ritual. Commanders paralyzed themselves with chicken entrails and bird calls because the gods' opinions could mean the difference between a triumphant parade and a gruesome mutiny, or worse, a battlefield massacre. This obsession with divine favor wasn't unique to Rome. Across the vast Mediterranean, the Greek hoplites took omens just as seriously. though their rituals could feel spooky by today's standards. Before a battle, generals might perform sacrifices, slicing open animals to divine future outcomes, reading entrails like a twisted, bloody version of tea leaves. One tiny mistake, a flinch in the ritual, a misread liver, and everything could be wrong. The belief was so intense that sometimes entire battles hinged not on tactical advantages, but on stubborn faith that the gods smiled upon a side. It created a peculiar mix of fatalism and bravado. Fight harder because the gods approve, or better yet, fight because you must, either way. Across the sea, in the Viking world, things weren't much different, but more, well, brutal. When a Norse warrior was about to swing his axe, gods like Odin and Thor weren't just distant deities. They were companions in bloodshed. The Norse believed Valkyries, the mysterious shield maidens, would swoop down to decide who lived and who died, selecting the chosen to feast in Valhalla. So the Vikings went into battle loaded with a mix of hope, fear, and an almost gleeful acceptance of death. After all, why fear dying if you believed death was literally an invitation to the ultimate party, surrounded by feasting and warriors? It's a chilling mindset, one that encouraged reckless ferocity, but also a strange kind of peace. Death wasn't defeat, it was destiny, and destiny was written by the gods. Meanwhile, in the cloudy, mist-shrouded islands of Japan, the notion of divine favor took on haunting, even ritualized forms. Samurai warriors didn't just seek approval from the gods or ancestors, they lived by it. Their code, Bushido, wove honor and the divine tightly together, insisting that to fail honorably was better than to survive dishonorably. And when the god's will was read as defeat, samurai met it with acts that seemed incomprehensibly brutal centuries later. Seppuku, or ritual suicide. Think of it as the ultimate I quit, but with meticulously precise ceremonial cuts instead of a resignation letter. It was a terrifyingly dignified refusal to be captured, a way to reclaim control in a world ruled by chaos and divine whim. Seppuku was more than just personal pride. It was a practice deeply embedded in religious belief, a final prayer to the gods and ancestors, a testament that even in death, the warrior upheld the cosmic order. A samurai soul, after this gruesome farewell, was thought to ascend to a place beyond mortal woes, arguably receiving the highest form of divine favor for embracing death on his own terms. Talk about dedication. Warriors across cultures echoed the same message. Death was inevitable, but how you met it shaped not just your legacy, but your passage to the afterlife. This obsession with divine signals and death rituals also steered commanders' decisions on the open seas. Take the galleys of the Mediterranean, long and slender ships powered by rowers who often sang war chants to keep rhythm and morale high. Before setting sail or engaging enemy fleets, naval officers would consult oracles, turn to the heavens, or examine the weather for divine signs. Storms could be blessings or curses. Calm seas might lull you to defeat. The gods had to be read not just in the stars, but in the murmuring waves and the screeching of gulls. Rejecting these ominous messages was a gamble that few could afford. And when commanders ignored these sacred warnings, history is littered with tales of fleets dashed on rocks or soldiers trapped in death traps. But blaming a god was as convenient as it was necessary. After all, admitting human error in the face of overwhelming divine will meant respecting the higher powers and preserving morale. Soldiers and sailors needed to believe that everything, including defeat, had meaning beyond the mortal coil. This belief softened the trauma of loss, gave soldiers a narrative, an explanation, an emotional anchor. It's fascinating, if somewhat tragic, how ancient warriors balanced between faith and fear, hope and despair. Belief in divine favor wasn't just a comfort, it was a weapon. Commanders wielded belief like a two-edged sword, cutting through doubt and rallying troops with promises that their cause was just, their victories preordained. When a general told his soldiers the gods favored their spear points, morale surged. When a priest declared a sacrifice had turned the tide, hesitation dissolved. But when the omens turned dark, acceptance of death took on an almost elegant form, a ritual resignation that transformed raw terror into stoic endurance. This intertwining of divine interpretation and the brutal necessities of warfare reminds us that ancient battles didn't merely happen on earth. They were fought in minds haunted by immortal eyes and in hearts bound by cosmic contracts. Warriors looked beyond the gore-soaked fields at swirling skies, listened for cryptic bird calls, and took solace or dread from entrails and omens. They fought with the gods watching, knowing that for every sword unsheathed there was a higher judgment, and sometimes that judgment meant embracing death not as a failure, but as the final sacred act in a long, unforgiving ritual. Because in the world bound by swords, galleys, and seppuku, death was never the end. It was simply the ultimate demand of ancient warfare. Imagine being chained in the stifling belly of a ship, the oppressive heat wrapping around you like a wet blanket, each breath thick with the stench of sweat, salt, and despair. Welcome to the world of the ancient galley rower, a world where glory tossed to show was a cruel illusion, masking the brutal grind beneath. Behind those triumphant naval victories that adorn the history books lies a darker, far more grueling story, the saga of slaves, convicts, and condemned men bound to their oars as if their very survival depended on the rhythm of their suffering. Galley rowing wasn't just hard, it was a form of living torture. These men were the engines of war, but unlike any machine, they were flesh and blood, broken slowly beneath the endless, punishing demands of their masters. Picture long wooden benches, cramped shoulder to shoulder, muscles trembling from exhaustion, but forced to keep pushing. The oar was more than a tool. It was the tether to a fate worse than death for many. Slaves were often pulled from every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond, bought and sold like livestock, stripped of all choice, their lives no more valuable than the ship's timber. Discipline on a galley was absolute. The ancient commanders might have been kings of the sea, but for the rowers, life was nothing short of brutal tyranny. Any sign of hesitation or weakness could mean immediate, violent repercussions. Whips cracked overhead, and the sound of wood striking flesh echoed beneath the deck in a terrible rhythm alongside the rowing. Some ancient sources even suggest that rowers were literally chained to their benches to prevent escape. Because yes, running away on a ship is a bit trickier than dashing down a street. Conditions? Forget about gentle sea breezes and sunny decks. The bottom of a galley was a furnace, especially in the searing heat of the Mediterranean summer. Rowers suffered from heat stroke, dehydration, and infections from cuts caused by the relentless friction between oar and human flesh. Blisters became raw wounds. When exhaustion hit, which it always did, those threats escalated into gangrene and death. Disease and malnutrition ganged up behind the scenes, thinning ranks silently long before battle was even joined. And what about the work itself? Rowing was not simply casual paddling. It demanded perfect synchronicity and bone-crushing stamina. The oarsman had to maintain an almost hypnotic uniformity of movement, smacking water with brutal efficiency to drive the ship forward as fast as the commander demanded. The idea was to outpace enemies, to ram, to board, to dominate sea lanes. But these outcomes came at the cost of thousands of ruined bodies. Ancient naval lore often glamorizes the fighting and the tactics, but it rarely bothers dusting off the grim reality of how many men perished long before the clash of swords. Then there's the madness factor. The monotony of rowing for hours on end, sometimes days without rest, was a mental prison as well as a physical one. Imagine waking each day chained to an oar, your future carved in exhaustion and hopelessness. The only audible sounds, the slap of oars and shouted orders. Many of these men had no future beyond the galley, facing decades trapped beneath a deck as unforgiving as the sea itself. For some, the threat of violent death at any moment, whether from punishment, enemy attack, or outright surrender and disposal, was a constant reminder that their existence was utterly expendable. Slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, these categories blurred on the galleys. The condemned were given a grim sort of reprieve if they agreed to take up the oar, serve your sentence by rowing yourself to death. Some were criminals sentenced to row till death, which in practice meant they usually did. Ancient societies didn't even bother to provide much medical care, and the occasional harshest forms of discipline were often a twisted sort of motivation to keep the men moving. The galley was less a place of redemption and more a floating, hellish assembly line. But let's not forget the subtle, cruel irony. These same rowers propelled ships that would etch their commanders' names into history. Their sweat was the fuel beneath mighty empires' expansion. Athenian triremes, Roman galleys, Carthaginian fleets, all roaring through the waves, singing songs of conquest while hiding the silence of suffering. Victory speeches and marbled statues celebrated naval exploits, but the real calorie count, the actual human cost, was invisible, buried beneath decks and centuries. If a ship sank, the fate of those rowers was almost always grim. Being chained or locked down meant drowning was a common end, far more common than the heroic death in battle the elites preferred to romanticize. The sea offered no mercy. Escape was almost impossible. The very instruments of their labor were sometimes turned against them in moments of desperate mutiny or punishment. Turning a tool of propulsion into a weapon, or their own bodies into bloodied masses on the deck. Discipline sometimes took on a strange paradox. While mercy was virtually unknown, survival depended heavily on cooperation. Without each man's labor perfectly timed and relentless, the ship would founder, sinking its crew and captains alike. A faltering rower wasn't just a risk to himself, but to everyone on board. This cruel interdependence, balanced on the knife's edge of command and submission, turned the galley into a kind of mechanical organism of human flesh and bone, driven by dread and duty alike. Could the men ever rest? Occasionally, if the fleet was anchored in friendly waters or successfully blockaded an enemy port, rowers could breathe briefly. But rest was sparing and never guaranteed. Often they were expected to row continuously during combat, a heart-pounding ordeal that demanded superhuman endurance. The smallest lapse was catastrophic, not just for the individual, but for the entire mission. In many ways, the plight of the galley rowers serves as a stark reminder that history's heroes often stood on the backs of the unwilling and the oppressed. Their grand victories owe as much to blood, sweat, and broken bodies as to brilliant tactics or gleaming swords. Behind every rushing ship cutting through the waves on a mission of conquest or salvation, there were faces burned by the sun, eyes wild with fatigue, hands blistered beyond recognition, and lives slipping away one grueling stroke at a time. So next time you see an ancient naval battle reenacted or a museum ship deck glittering in the sun, spare a thought for those invisible oarsmen, slaves and convicts dragged from oblivion to haul these magnificent machines over the endless horizon, bound in chains that were harsher than any battle. Because the truth of ancient warfare is that behind the glory rides a shadow, exhaustion and suffering, ever rowing toward oblivion. Imagine living in a world where a single insult could spiral into years, sometimes decades, of bloodshed, where a minor injury to a family member demands not just apology, but severe retribution, and where the line between justice and endless revenge blurs into a brutal cycle of violence that consumes entire clans. This wasn't some dystopian fiction. It was everyday reality in many ancient societies, shaped by relentless honor cultures. The concept of personal and familial vengeance wasn't just accepted, it was expected, demanded even, as a vital part of maintaining one's standing, dignity, and survival. And once that wheel of vengeance started turning, good luck stopping it without a river of blood flowing first. Honor culture turned the past into a ticking time bomb. Imagine every slight, every insult, every injury as a match dropped in a powder keg. Each incident an excuse for retaliation, and retaliation, in turn, mandated another strike back. This wasn't mindless violence, but a deadly serious social contract encoded in the fabric of society. You didn't just fight for land or power. You fought because to do otherwise was to admit weakness, and weakness was a sure path to obliteration, not just of you, but of your entire lineage. Take ancient Japan as a prime example. Samurai warriors didn't just carry swords, they carried centuries of expectations about honor, loyalty, and deadly duty. A single act of betrayal or dishonor could compel a samurai to perform seppuku, a ritual suicide meant to restore lost honor in the most extreme fashion. But it didn't always end there. If your clan was humiliated or slaughtered, you owed it to your ancestors to hunt down every last enemy, sometimes washing your hands in their blood to cleanse the stain on your family name. The phrase, "an eye for an eye," doesn't quite capture this. This was an eye for an eye, and then another for good measure, and maybe keep going until they're all wiped out. Clans in Japan often found themselves locked in endless feuds, not just over territory, but over slights, betrayals, and broken codes of conduct that, to outsiders, probably seemed petty or insane. But in those tightly knit communities, honor was currency. Lose it, and your clan might find itself outcast, vulnerable, or destroyed. Gain it, and you secured respect, alliances, and survival. Similarly, among the fierce warrior societies of Europe and the Mediterranean, personal vengeance was equally pervasive. Consider the blood feuds of the ancient Gauls or the vendettas that plagued Romano-Celtic tribes. These cycles of retaliation meant that whole families could live in a state of near constant armed readiness, turning every minor conflict into a potential bloodbath. The practice of taking hostages wasn't just to guarantee peace. It was a survival tactic, a way to prevent the inevitable eruption of violence by holding the lives of prominent clan members as bargaining chips. But even hostages couldn't always stop the fires of vengeance from burning across generations. Across the seas, in the brutal world of naval warfare, among the Mediterranean's ancient city-states, honor and revenge dictated the battles as much as strategies or the prowess of oarsmen. Losing a naval engagement wasn't just a matter of losing ships. It was a stain on a city's pride, a blow to the ruling elite's reputation that demanded redress. And redress would come, often more viciously than before. The demands for vengeance rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into a still pond, drawing more fleets, more warriors, more families into the fray. What fueled this relentless cycle wasn't merely pride, but a complex social logic. Honor wasn't an abstract notion. It was the glue holding the social order together. Without it, trust dissolved. People turned on each other, and the chaos of endless disputes threatened to tear societies apart. And yet, for all its violence, this system also offered a twisted kind of stability. It codified expectations and provided a framework, flawed and deadly as it was, for negotiating power and respect. Of course, none of this tragedy played out on a clean battlefield. The personal nature of honor-based vengeance meant civilians, women, and children were often caught in the line of fire. Old grudges disrupted economies, depleted manpower, and forced rulers into difficult positions where they might have to feign impartiality while secretly blessing one clan's campaign of revenge to keep a precarious balance of power. It's no wonder these cycles of violence often seemed impossible to escape, like a horrific chain reaction set off by a single misstep. Even the practical realities of ancient warfare were shaped by these social demands. Battles were rarely fought for abstract concepts like national interest. Instead, they were deeply personal affairs, where the failure to avenge a wrong could be seen as tantamount to cowardice or death itself. Warriors might march into battle not just on orders from a king, but because they bore the scars of family dishonor that screamed for satisfaction. In this sense, each sword slashed, each arrow loosed, each galley rowed across stormy seas was also a fulfillment of social contracts embedded in honor and retribution. Ironically, while personal vengeance perpetuated destruction, it often motivated warriors to acts of great valor and sacrifice. Faces hardened by years of familial pain and expectation pushed knights, samurai, and soldiers into legendary feats because their lives were bound to something larger, even if that larger was a vicious loop of vendettas. This was society throwing individuals into the grinder of history, where personal rage meshed with collective struggle, sometimes producing stories of heroism, other times endless tragedy. And yet, amidst the brutality, some moments showed the strange human attempts to control or break these cycles. Rituals of apology, marriage alliances, or acts of generous clemency could occasionally pause or at least delay the violent spiral. But the demands of honor were strict and peace fragile. One small misstep, one forgotten insult, and the drums of war would start beating again. So when we look back at the shattered clans, burnt villages, and rivers of blood left in the wake of ancient wars, we're not just witnessing the horrors of primitive conflict. We're seeing the harsh truths of societies bound by codes that turned every grievance into a matter of life, death, and dreadful pride. Vengeance wasn't just a choice, it was a mandate, an obligation that could trap entire generations in cycles of violence that only death or ultimate defeat could break. In the end, these cycles illustrate a fundamental paradox of early human societies. The very values meant to preserve honor and social order could just as easily burn everything to the ground. Honor may have been a weapon as sharp and deadly as any sword or galley ram, cutting both ways through the fragile web of ancient communities. Picture the battlefield of antiquity, not just a chaotic mess of shouting warriors and clashing metal, but a deadly symphony of ingenuity, muscle, and brutal efficiency. Behind every slash of a sword and cannonade of a siege engine lies the story of minds obsessed with one goal: outlasting, outsmarting, and ultimately obliterating the enemy. To truly grasp the raw demands of ancient warfare, you need to get close, closer than the arrow whizzing past your ear, and understand the deadly arsenal these warriors wielded, along with the cunning design of the monstrous machines that tore through fortress walls and shattered more than just morale. Let's start with the handheld weapons, the ones a soldier didn't just carry, but lived and died by. The sword, for instance, was never just a blade. It was an extension of the warrior's very soul. Take the Japanese katana, curved, razor-sharp, and balanced with such precision, it could slice through leather and flesh as if they were made of air. But this wasn't just about craftsmanship. It was about the brutal art of killing, perfected over centuries. The katana's edge was honed to such a degree that any hesitation in a fight would be fatal. A single, clean cut was all it took. No maiming here. This was efficiency, downright surgical, split through bone, sinew, and even armor if the swordsman had the skill and nerve. And yet, carrying a katana was a social statement as much as a military asset. It screamed, "I am death, wrapped in silk and steel." What could be more intimidating to your opponent than the prospect of a sweep so deadly it becomes almost merciful in its finality? But the katana was far from the only sword with a killer reputation. The Roman gladius might not have the romance of the samurai's blade, but it was a merciless tool designed for brutal close-quarters combat. Short, sharp, and built for stabbing over slashing, The gladius turned Roman legions into precisely coordinated death machines. Imagine the tight formation, the shield wall, almost like a human tank, while each soldier prodded, jabbed, and skewed anyone foolish enough to get close. It was less dance, more executioner's march. The efficiency of the gladius lay in its simplicity, easy to use, easy to repair, and above all, deadly in the hands of thousands marching in unison. On the other hand, ancient warriors also wielded axes, maces, and daggers that brought a different kind of terror to the battlefield. The axe wasn't just a chopping tool, it was a sledgehammer disguised as a blade. A powerful swing could crush helmets, break shields, and churn bone into splinters. For example, the Vikings were notorious for their devastating bearded axes, which could cleave a shield in two with a single blow, and then follow up with vicious hand-to-hand combat. And those maces? They had the subtle charm of turning armored foes into paste. While swords could be parried and arrows dodged, a mace came down like an angry god's hammer, smashing through defenses like they were toothpicks. No elegant flourish, just raw, crushing force. Still, handheld weapons were only part of the picture. When it came to tearing down walls or crushing enemy formations from afar, siege engines were the true terror of the battlefield, and the ancient engineers who built them deserve a standing ovation for creativity mixed with cruelty. Imagine massive wooden contraptions taller than a few soldiers stacked on each other, loaded with stones large enough to flatten men, horses, and entire sections of city walls. Ballistae launched giant bolts that could pin a warrior to a gate like an insect on a pinboard. Catapults hurled stones the size of small boulders, thundering through the air, guided by nothing but gravity and the wrath of their operators. Take the Roman onager, for example, a machine that looked like a cross between a giant crossbow and a medieval seesaw. When tension was released, it would fling a rock with such force that it could not only puncture walls, but also send enemy soldiers flying through the air. And those walls weren't just structural barriers, they were the last line of defense for an entire city's population. Destroying them was both a practical blow and a psychological blow. Imagine watching your once impenetrable walls crumble, stone by stone, while those massive arms flung destruction closer and closer, each impact echoing the grim inevitability of defeat. Don't forget the greased ramparts, the flaming arrows, or dripping boiling oil. Primitive, yes, but shockingly effective when combined with the thunderous barrage of siege engines. The attackers often had to coordinate complex assaults that were a deadly dance in death and destruction. Siege towers, lumbering like mechanical beasts, crept slowly toward walls, sliding ramparts, allowing warriors to pour onto ramparts, while defenders hurled rocks, fires, and curses down at them. And you wondered why a besieged city would resort to seppuku. Ritual suicide wasn't just about honor. It was sometimes a mercy. When defeat was certain, ending your own life retained some shred of dignity before the enemy's blade or the chaos of sack and slaughter. Speaking of the lethal dance between human ingenuity and primal savagery, naval warfare deserves a nod here as well, especially the galleys. These sleek warships, rowed by hundreds of oarsmen sinking their strength like a living engine, were the fighter jets of the ancient seas. Unlike the sailing ships of later centuries, galleys depended on muscle power to move swiftly, ram, and outmaneuver enemies. The prow of these vessels was often decked out with a bronze ram. Imagine a spearhead designed not to jab, but to punch holes in the sides of enemy ships, sending warriors and wood alike to their watery grave. The entire crew worked in terrifying harmony. Think of a deadly underwater ballet where mistakes meant capsizing or drowning. Combat atop these swaying decks was no less intense than on land. Archers, spear throwers, and boarding parties clashing in close combat amid the shrieks of wind, waves, and blood-curdling screams. Ultimately, ancient warfare was a brutal symphony conducted by the sharpness of blades, the crash of siege engines, and the desperate courage of men who knew that at any moment a single mistake could mean a grisly death. The deadly arsenal they wielded was a testament not only to humanity's endless capacity for violence, but also to remarkable engineering and tactical genius that made wars both horrific and mesmerizing. So next time you imagine those fierce warriors, remember, hidden behind every graceful slash, every thunderous engine, and every fearless charge is a story of deadly precision, cold calculation, and brutal necessity. A reminder that sometimes history's most elegant tools were crafted for one harrowing purpose: to end life swiftly and efficiently. When the dust settled on the battlefield, victory wasn't just a matter of who held the ground. It was a brutal alley of what happened to those left standing, or more often, kneeling in chains. Ancient warfare rarely afforded mercy. The fate of prisoners and the conquered was a living nightmare, a grim aftermath soaked in blood, fear, and a chilling calculus of power. It's one thing to swing a sword in the heat of battle, another entirely to decide the destiny of those who could no longer fight back. Imagine the warlords and commanders surveying a scene that looked less like a triumph and more like a grotesque auction. A parade of captives, broken soldiers, desperate civilians, all reeking of sweat and defeat. These prisoners were not simply disarmed or escorted back to prison camps. They were bargaining chips, tools of terror, and sometimes walking proof of a ruthless conquest. The stakes were clear. Mercy was a luxury few could afford because unchecked compassion was often seen as weakness. Brutality, on the other hand, was a language everyone understood. It might sound barbaric when viewed through today's lenses, but ancient commanders had reasons, however ruthless, for their bloody decisions. Taking prisoners was expensive, feeding and guarding them a logistical headache in volatile environments. What's more, sparing opponents invited the risk of rebellion and the unpleasant possibility that tomorrow's enemies might be yesterday's captives. So the sword often stayed busy even after the main fighting ceased. Prisoners might be held for ransom, held as king's pawns in the deadly chess game of politics and power, if they were deemed valuable enough. Nobles, officers, or rich merchants could fetch a king's ransom, literally, but for most, their future was a grim lottery. Many became slaves, condemned to toil in chains, digging ditches, or rowing galley ships under a sun merciless enough to cook flesh. And those were the lucky ones. Others faced outright execution, sometimes public and theatrical, to send a clear message: resist, and this is how your story ends. Consider the Roman practice after a decisive victory. Roman soldiers, notoriously proud and exacting, sometimes celebrated not just by raising the imperial eagle, but by ruthlessly displaying the bodies of the defeated among the roads for miles, a macabre warning to anyone contemplating rebellion. Generals couldn't afford to look weak, and these acts of cruelty, horrific as they were, helped maintain order in an empire spanning continents. The ancient Japanese battlefield carried its own brutal traditions. When defeat was inevitable, the samurai, and often their families, turned to seppuku, a ritual suicide designed to reclaim honor in the face of disgrace. It sounds poetic, maybe even dignified, but behind that veneer lay a stark reality, an absolute societal demand to die on your own terms, rather than live as a captive or disgraced survivor. For the defeated in this context, captivity wasn't just defeat. It was existence stripped of dignity and purpose. Seppuku was a violent refusal to surrender power to the enemy, a final act of control in the chaos of conquest. On the shores of the Mediterranean, the ancient galley rowers, often prisoners themselves, suffered a fate that balanced on the knife's edge between servitude and death. Imagine chained to a bench with feet strapped in place, muscles screaming as you rowed not just for survival, but to keep the empire afloat. The galleys were flowing prisons, and life expectancy was alarmingly low. One wrong move, one wave swallowing a man beside you, and the sea became a watery grave. There was no surrendering on these ships. It meant certain death somewhere short of shore. These atrocities were not merely the excesses of war. They were calculated, brutal strategies. Fear was a tool. Fear of capture, fear of execution, fear of total annihilation. This fear kept populations in check, discouraged rebellion, and turned conquered peoples into manageable subjects rather than immediate threats. Empires were built on this delicate balance of terror and control. And it wasn't just about individual fates. Entire cities, cultures, and civilizations lived under this brutal shadow. Conquered populations were sometimes subjected to wholesale massacres, an absolute erasure of resistance. Other times, survivors were forcibly relocated, their homes razed, and their identities stripped, all to prevent them from rising against their new rulers. The scorched earth wasn't just a military tactic. It was psychological warfare writ large on the canvas of civilization. Yet, at the heart of this relentless brutality lies a stark, uncomfortable truth. Power in the ancient world rarely tolerated softness. Leadership demanded ruthlessness because a single act of mercy could unravel entire campaigns or ignite sparks of rebellion. If you wanted to hold an empire together, you had to be willing to make people fear not only the strength of your sword, but the coldness of your resolve. It's tempting to vilify these ancient commanders as monsters, yet many were products of their own brutal world. They operated under a set of harsh rules, where survival depended on sending clear, unmistakable messages of dominance. Letting a single enemy live could mean the difference between peace and a protracted, blood-soaked insurgency. In their minds, cruelty was a necessary evil, an investment in long-term stability. But that investment came at enormous human cost. Families shattered, cultures crushed beneath unforgiving wheels of conquest, individual lives reduced to prizes or warnings. The aftermath of battle was a horror not just because of the fighting, but because what followed often codified suffering into a routine of domination. Victory, in this context, wasn't the end of violence, it was merely the beginning of a new kind. So when you picture ancient warriors wielding swords, think beyond the clash of steel and the roar of battle. Picture the silent, haunting aftermath that followed. The shackled captives, the forced marches, the whispered prayers before a blade ended a life in seppuku. These were the brutal demands that ancient warfare didn't just tolerate, but required, a grim testament to what it truly meant to conquer, to survive, and to rule. When we think of ancient warfare, visions of heavily armored men clashing with swords and shouting war cries often dominate our imagination. Yet peering beyond the smoke and steel reveals a much more complex and, frankly, far more interesting battlefield. One where women were not just background noise, but pivotal players of courage, cunning, and sheer survival. From the chilling and fierce shield maidens of the Norse sagas to the grim reality faced by camp followers, women were woven deeply into the fabric of ancient conflict, sometimes brandishing axes, other times clutching infants, often doing both under the cruelest conditions imaginable. Let's start with the shield maidens, those semi-legendary female warriors who rode into battle as if the concept of fragile femininity was a joke told by Odin himself. Contrary to popular opinion, Norse women weren't all tending fire and weaving cloth. Some were riders on the storm, warriors who embraced the taste of iron and the roar of the battlefield. Archaeologists have uncovered graves filled with weapons, bows, and armor that belonged unmistakably to women, upending centuries of assumptions. These women were no side stories. They stood shoulder to shoulder with men, using axes to rip through shields and swords to carve their names into history. One particularly striking figure is Lagertha, who might sound more like a heroine from a binge-worthy TV show than an actual Viking warrior. But her story echoes through time nonetheless. Chronicled by the 12th century historian Saxo Grammaticus, Lagertha was no mere myth. She fought valiantly beside her husband, and later led troops herself after their separation, because honestly, why stop at being a fighting partner when you can be a war commander? Even if some details drift into the haze of legend, the very existence of such narratives highlights that women warriors weren't simply a quirky exception. They were part of the fabric of Norse martial culture, challenging modern stereotypes with smirks and swinging swords. But, of course, war wasn't just about those glamorous moments on the battlefield. Much more often, women endured the brutal, thankless roles behind the lines as camp followers. This is where the romantic veneer of conquest peels away to reveal harsh, unvarnished realities. These followers were not simply passive bystanders or mere tag-alongs. They formed the backbone of ancient armies, their contributions absolutely indispensable. They cooked, sewed, healed, and sometimes fought, but more often their presence was a grim testament to survival amid chaos. Imagine trudging alongside legions of tired, bloodied soldiers through mud, starvation, and plague, hauling your belongings and the hopes of your family. Camp followers carried the burden of war's brutal logistics, often more cruelly punished and overlooked than the soldiers themselves. Their stories are frequently lost in the epics glorifying kings and generals, yet they walked the thin line where survival was often a lottery of cruelty. Some ended up as slaves, others took up arms when the worst arrived, while many simply prayed to see the next dawn. In ancient Rome, the chaos of the legions was tempered by the presence of women in various roles, some even wielding weapons when required. Female auxiliaries or camp assistants weren't just background actors. They were pragmatic necessities in the grind of endless marching and skirmishes. Women like Fulvia come to mind, not a camp follower, but rather a fiery political and military player who raised troops alongside her husband and even commanded forces herself during Rome's civil wars. Her story shatters the sanitized version of Roman matrons confined to the home. Instead, she wielded influence and power with the same tactical brutality as her male counterparts, proving that ancient warfare's gender lines were blurrier than textbooks suggest. Meanwhile, in ancient Japan, the samurai code that defined honor on the battlefield also cast women into a brutal but complex tradition. On the one hand, many women from samurai families were trained in martial arts, ready to defend their homes when the men were off fighting. On the other, the specter of seppuku, the ritual suicide, haunted samurai households like an ever-present shadow. The idea wasn't for women to charge into battle with swords raised like their male kin. Instead, they were often expected to preserve family honor through sacrifice, sometimes taking their own lives rather than face capture, disgrace, or worse. It's a harsh reminder that the demands of ancient warfare extended far beyond the front line, pressuring everyone, man or woman, to meet impossible codes. In some cases, women's endurance exploded in dazzling resistance. Take the story of the Onna Bugeisha, female warriors of the samurai class, sometimes stepping into the fray with naginatas, pole weapons, in hand, cutting through enemy ranks when the situation grew desperate. These women defied standard gender norms with every battle cry, cloaked in the same discipline and ferocity their male counterparts wielded. And while popular culture sometimes romanticizes tales of female warriors with a soft glow, the truth is far more visceral. Bloodied blades, brutal duels, and lives lost amid the ashes of feudal conflict define their legacy. But warfare's brutality was seldom kind or forgiving. Whether a shield maiden fighting Odin's calling, a Roman matron standing amid the dusty legions, or a samurai wife facing the knife with grim resolve, women's stories in ancient warfare pulsate with a blend of courage, desperation, and resilience that defy easy categorization. They shaped history not just by stepping onto battlefields, but by enduring the long, cruel aftermath of war, the pillaging, the hunger, the terror that stretched far beyond the clash of swords. The scars borne by women, from campfires to castles, remind us that war's brutality was a lived experience for all, regardless of gender. Their voices may echo faintly through history's corridors, but those faint echoes crack open the deadly myths of ancient conflict to reveal a world where survival was as much about grit and guile as it was about muscle and metal. And in that revelation, we find a raw, unvarnished humanity beneath the gold and gore of empire, a truth both sobering and oddly inspiring. Imagine standing on the blood-soaked deck of a galley, the stench of sweat, salt, and fear hanging thick in the air, your hands slick with the grime of endless battle, your mind caught in a storm fiercer than any sea. Around you, comrades fall, some with swords torn from their grasp, others who embrace death not at the hands of the enemy, but by their own choice. It's a moment suspended between survival and annihilation, where loyalty clashes violently with personal honor, and the question isn't just how to live, but whether living is even worth it. This is the mental battlefield ancient warriors faced, the relentless psychological crucible that only few histories dare to examine closely. We tend to romanticize the clash of swords and the thunder of galleys cutting through choppy waters. But behind each heroic charge lay decisions so brutal, so soul-wrenching, they haunt us centuries later. What do you do when your only paths lead to shame, captivity, or death? When the code you live by demands more than mere courage? When surrender means dishonor, and resistance means certain demise? Take the samurai, for instance, the ultimate embodiment of a warrior culture steeped in unyielding honor. The image of the samurai gallantly waving his katana is something of a Hollywood cliché, but the brutal reality was far from effortless. The samurai didn't just fight enemies, they battled disloyalty, shame, and the crushing weight of expectations. Failure was a debt paid in blood, sometimes your own, through the ritual of seppuku. Seppuku was a violent suicide, performed not in despair, but as a defiant assertion of control, the final act of loyalty to a code that said, "I would rather gut myself than live with disgrace." Imagine being so cornered by dishonor that taking your own life with a painstakingly self-inflicted abdominal cut, followed by your trusted friend or attendants decapitating you to spare prolonged agony, becomes the rational choice. It sounds barbaric to modern sensibilities, and it was, but to a samurai, it was the height of dignity, a way to rewrite a narrative of failure one last time with razor-sharp precision. Yet, the mental anguish preceding the act was unimaginable. The stoic mask was often a fragile facade masking despair, trauma, and a gnawing inner battle. Honor was a religion, and the price of heresy was your own death. But the samurai weren't alone in these impossible dilemmas. Across the Mediterranean, rowers and fighters on ancient galleys, a floating hell where cramped conditions made disease and dehydration as deadly as enemy arrows, were trapped in their own agonizing paradox. Life aboard a warship was social hell. Forced to work in near-slavery conditions, chained to their oars, these men were caught between survival and servitude, and their loyalty was often coerced rather than earned. During naval battles, when defeat turned imminent, and it often did, warriors faced terrifying choices. What did defeat mean? Capture and enslavement, or worse, death. It was not unheard of for rowers and soldiers to leap overboard to avoid the shame of capture. Suicide at sea, a desperate, often futile act, because the water was cold, deep, and indifferent. Escape was a fleeting hope. Survival was a cruel test of endurance, laced with despair. In some instances, captains would order mass suicide rather than allow their crew's capture, a grim act that underscores how dreadfully intertwined death and honor were in military ethos. The mental toll of such orders must have been crushing. You're a commander staring down annihilation, and the only leadership you can muster is to tell your men to die by their own hand so the enemy won't claim their souls. This wasn't just a battle of flesh and blood, but a fractured psyches. Honor in ancient warfare was more than personal pride. It was social currency, spiritual insurance, and psychological shackle all rolled into one. For many warriors, surrender meant dishonor, and dishonor could ripple beyond death, staining families and communities for generations. This intense pressure shaped battlefield behavior in ways that modern warfare, with its emphasis on strategic withdrawal and survival, often does not replicate. Let's shift from the ocean back to the smoldering fields and fortresses where warriors stood locked in deadly grips, their minds spiraling in a vortex of loyalty and despair. In many cultures, captured officers or defeated leaders faced an unbearable predicament: how to reconcile defeat with unwavering allegiance to their lord or cause. Escape was rarely an option. Surrender was a brand of betrayal. Some would rather fight to the last breath, turning hopeless battles into suicides by attrition. Each death a stubborn refusal to concede even the smallest advantage to the enemy. Others chose death on their own terms, staging last stands or ritualistic suicides that fused spectacle with sacrifice. These displays were as much about sending messages to the living as they were about ending their own suffering. Death had to be meaningful. Sound dramatic? Of course it was. Ancient warfare was never just about clashing weapons. It was a theater where the most profound human conflicts, fear, shame, ambition, love of country or kin, played out amid the blood and chaos. The soldiers, sailors, and warriors didn't just wrestle with enemy forces, but with their own minds and morals. This internal warfare could ripple into madness, depression, or acts of brutal desperation. Historical records hint at moments when exhausted warriors, pushed over the brink, committed atrocities on friend and foe alike. spurred less by cruelty than by a fraying grip on sanity. War, in its most primitive and relentless form, was a brutal teacher of human limits. And yet, despite all this horror, or maybe because of it, these mental and emotional battles forged warriors whose legacies echo through history. Swords were wielded not only against enemies, but against the torment within. Galleys became prisons where physical and psychological endurance were inseparable. Seppuku became a haunting testament to a code that demanded supreme loyalty above life itself. The price of honor wasn't measured in gold or land. It was paid in pain, in suffering, and for many in blood-soaked sacrifice. In the end, the brutal demands of ancient warfare weren't just about who survived on the battlefield, but who survived within, and what it cost them when those two were painfully out of balance. Picture the chaos of the ancient sea battlefield, the relentless clash of wooden galleys, the sharp scrape of bronze rams slicing through hulls like butter, and the sky darkened by flying arrows and the screams of men hurtling through the air. Naval combat in antiquity was not some polite exchange across calm waters. It was brutal, unforgiving, and demanded a level of coordination that could make or break entire civilizations. Galleys, those sleek oar-driven warships, were the dreadnoughts of their age. Unlike the sailing vessels we picture today lazily harnessing the wind, galleys relied on hundreds of men pumping their oars in unison, like some terrifying underwater beast gliding swiftly towards its prey. The rhythmic pounding of rowing was not just a method of propulsion. It was a rhythmic war drum that set the tempo for battle. Without perfect synchronization, the whole ship might turn into a sitting duck. Imagine trying to steer 100 rowers without a conductor. Chaos. But when the oarsmen came together, the galley became an extension of its captain's will, a predator able to outmaneuver and outpace enemies. One of the most famous encounters illustrating this was the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, where the Greek fleet faced off against the seemingly unstoppable Persian armada. The Persian galleys, bulky and numerous, expected an easy victory. Instead, the nimbleness of the Greek triremes, with their triple banks of rowers, proved decisive. Within the constricted waters of the straits, where space was a precious commodity, the Greeks exploited their intimate familiarity with the terrain, turning their ships like scissors and jabbing the bronze rams into the flanks of enemy vessels with deadly precision. One ram to the hull, and the Persian ship could rapidly become a watery grave. But naval warfare was not just about speed and maneuverability. It was an art of horrors on layers deeper than the obvious smashing of ships. Think about the boarding actions that followed the initial clash. Galleys drew alongside one another, and the battle shifted to the deck, a brutal, stinking melee of steel, sweat, and blood. Here, the ultimate weapon was the human body, because Marines, archers, and sailors fought with the desperation of men staring down death. Naval combat killed with an unimaginably high personal cost. Unlike land battles, where a soldier could retreat behind ranks, here the enemy was a few feet away, with nothing but the choppy sea and death itself behind you. The gulf between glory and oblivion was crossed in a matter of moments, and surrender was often unthinkable, either dishonorably ceding your fate or turning it into a searing shame. For the captains and crews, losing was not just about the loss of a ship, it was the devastating collapse of their honor and livelihood. Ramming an enemy ship to sink was one method. Boarding was another. But what about fire? Setting a ship ablaze in the midst of a tightly packed flotilla meant not just weaponizing flames, but terror. The Greek fire, a flaming liquid concocted by the Byzantines centuries after Salamis, comes to mind as a terrifyingly effective ancient napalm. Imagine attempting to douse flames while your ship slanted towards the abyss, the smell of burning pitch choking your lungs, and your fellow sailors screaming as they plunged overboard. In a way, the coordination required for such engagements made ancient naval warfare an unparalleled test of discipline. The galley captain was part general, part coach, part psychologist, all while keeping an eye on the enemy and managing the fitness of his ship's numerous crew. Oar movements had to be flawless. Signals had to transmit clearly. Any misstep could cause a fatal collision or loss of speed, leaving a ship vulnerable to attack. And yet, in the eye of the storm of cedar and bronze, some captains found glory with brilliant tactics. Consider the Carthaginian admiral Hannibal Gisco, who at times managed to outwit larger fleets by leveraging tight formations and coordinated boarding parties. It was a chess game on water, with lives poured like dice on every move. But not all naval commanders survived their battles to tell the tale. Seppuku was less common here than on land, but themes of honor played out just as intensely. Defeat at sea could mean months, if not years, of misery in captivity, or a lifetime haunted by disgrace. Yet, this was the price they paid for controlling vital trade routes and defending city-states whose very existence depended on naval supremacy. It's tempting to think that ancient naval encounters were just gritty, straightforward slugfests. But beneath the surface, they were elaborate dances of strategy and raw human will, where timing, precision, and sheer brutality decided who lived to see another dawn. The galloping rows of oars in the morning, the thunderous ramming at noon, the cacophonous boarding frenzy by afternoon, they're echoes of a world where the sea was a deadly stage for some of history's most dramatic and savage confrontations. Ancient sailors weren't just fighting for their city or king. They fought against the vast unpredictability of the ocean itself, facing impossible odds with nothing but wooden ships, bronze weapons, and raw courage. Their battles remind us that centuries before modern navies, the control of seas wasn't won by technology alone, but by coordination, brutality, and an unbreakable resolve to withstand death dancing just over the prow. So next time you gaze out over a calm sea, remember, beneath that tranquil surface lay a relentless war theater where swords clanged, men screamed, and the stakes were nothing less than survival, honor, and the fate of empires. Imagine standing on the verge of battle in an era where war wasn't just a clash of armies, but a full sensory onslaught, a spectacle designed to unnerve, to mystify, and to steel one's own nerve against the chaos ahead. The ancient world knew well that victory was as much a game of psychology and ritual as it was of brute force. Armies didn't just march forward clanking. They flared, boomed, and bled symbolic meaning into the very air around them. Preparing for war was a performance, and the warrior was an actor bound to a demanding and often merciless script. Take a moment to picture the clash of steel and the rattle of wooden shields on a Greek battlefield. But before the first spear ever flew, there was a ritualistic energy crackling through the air. Greek hoplites didn't just slap on their bronze armor and dive in. They engaged in dances and chants to summon the favor of gods, to forge unity, and above all, to strike fear into their foes. It was intimidation with a poetic flair. The rhythm of marching feet, the coordinated raising of shields to form an impenetrable wall, the flash of polished spearheads in the morning sun. Every movement was rehearsed intimidation, the military equivalent of a wrestler flexing before a match. Yet it wasn't just about mass and noise. The symbolisms engraved into their gear, the colors they chose, the choice of insignia and flags spoke volumes. Colors weren't merely decorations. Crimson meant blood and valor, while black whispered death and shadow. It was psychological warfare before a fist was ever thrown. These signals communicated codes about identity, status, and intent that shaped the battlefield's mood long before the armies closed. Dropped south and east to the Mediterranean's churning waters, and the scene changes, but the script stays just as intense. The war galley, those slender, oar-powered death machines, were displays of calculated terror on waves. These vessels were not just tools of war, they were theaters of ritualized brutality. In Carthage, with their shimmering bronze prows carved to resemble fierce animals or fearsome deities, the very sight of a fleet could freeze an enemy's resolve. Rowers drilled relentlessly, their synchronized strokes punctuated by chants or war cries. This wasn't a casual boat ride, It was high-stakes choreography where timing could mean the difference between glory and disaster. Every flogging of an oar into the water was a beat in the song of impending slaughter. The expectations for these seamen bordered on the fanatical. They weren't just soldiers. They were part of a living, breathing war machine whose efficiency depended on their discipline and iron will. Mutiny or hesitation weren't just failures. They were invitations to death by comrades or enemies. Before battle, captains often held elaborate religious ceremonies involving sacrifices and blessings intended to lock the troops' spirits in a shared covenant of courage and fatalism. It's hard not to see echoes of this in modern military traditions, although today's rituals thankfully usually include less bloodletting and more stiff salutes. Crossing over to the east, Japan wrapped its martial preparation in a web of ritual that ran even deeper, where psychology, honor, and death intertwined so seamlessly that the battlefield was as much a sacred space as a killing ground. Here, warriors didn't just prepare to fight, they prepared themselves to die with a dignity that modern sensibilities find both baffling and haunting. The samurai's path to battle was studded with rituals designed to summon not only courage but a spiritual readiness. It wasn't about bravado or flexing muscle, but an unflinching embrace of mortality. The ritual most famously associated with this lethal readiness was, of course, seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment. Far from a mere act of despair, seppuku was a grim form of performance art, a final statement of honor and defiance when defeat, capture, or disgrace loomed. It was a brutal, painfully methodical way of saying, "I define my death, not my enemies." On the eve of war, samurai would often write death poems, short, sharp verses packed with acceptance and reflection, a kind of poetic mic drop in anticipation of their possible demise. Armor was donned with meticulous care. Every plate and cord was arranged not just to protect the body, but to present an intimidating visage of fearlessness. The helmet, often decorated with exaggerated crests or masks, was designed to strike terror into the hearts of opponents. Like walking demons from a nightmare, samurai turned battle into theater, at once deeply serious, spectacular, and terrifying. Even the soundscapes played a part. The coordinated beating of drums and the haunting calls of conch shells were both battle signals and psychological weapons, engineered to unsettle the nerves of enemies and galvanize comrades. In a world where communication was limited, these oral signals made the difference between coordinated chaos and complete disaster. The precision of these rituals was as vital as the sharpness of the blade. But what about those lower in the ranks or on the fringes of these grand spectacles? Far from being spectators, auxiliary forces, light infantry, and sailors had their own rites, often less romantic but equally crucial. The harsh realities of ancient warfare meant subordinate troops might drink bitter concoctions to dull pain or stiffen resolve, or engage in superstitious acts believed to grant protection or luck. An army was a psychological mosaic, strung together by shared customs, fears, and beliefs, just as much as by discipline and training. It's tempting to view these rituals as quaint or archaic. After all, modern warfare boasts drones, precision strikes, and digital communication. But strip away the tech, and the human ingredient remains unchanged. People heading to violence under immense pressure, desperately seeking mental armor to withstand fear, fatigue, and the appalling chaos of combat. The ancient rituals, a war dance, a prayer, a poem about death, remind us that, beyond strategy and weaponry, war has always demanded a form of theater to prepare the human spirit for its darkest hours. In those rituals, the ancient world found a way to make sense of the senseless, order out of anarchy, and courage from the gnawing dread that underpinned every battle. To the soldiers of old, the quirks and ceremonies weren't just traditions. They were lifelines tossed in stormy seas. And sometimes they were the only thing standing between survival and oblivion. By the time the dust settled on countless battlefields, when the swords were finally sheathed and the galleys docked after storms of blood and fire, the echoes of ancient warfare had already begun reshaping the world's social fabric in weirs far more profound than the mere shifting of borders. These brutal conflicts were not just about territory or plunder. They carved deep grooves into the societal bedrock, altering who wielded power, how technology evolved, and even how people understood honor and identity. Take this social aftermath first. Ancient warfare didn't just dispatch armies, it disrupted entire communities, leaving survivors to navigate a landscape that was suddenly both physically and socially barren. Entire classes could be wiped out or displaced. Warriors turned into refugees, slaves, or worse, which in turn led to new social hierarchies. For example, in many Mediterranean societies, the repeated demands of naval warfare required colossal human labor, fueling slavery on an almost industrial scale. Rowers in the grim, cramped galleys became living engines, slaves or conscripts chained to their oars, pounding out rhythm to the music of impending death. This meant that the economy and society itself started to hinge on an abundant supply of humans to fuel war machines. Yet, paradoxically, these dire conditions often sparked social change. The constant drain of able-bodied men forced communities to experiment with new roles and responsibilities. Women, often sidelined in peacetime, stepped into roles of power and influence as guardians of households, stewards of resources, and even political actors in rare cases. In Japan, the relentless cycles of clan warfare and the code of honor around seppuku, ritual suicide, helped cement the samurai class as both military and social elites, embedding a brutal martial ethos deeply into the culture. Honor was no longer simply a personal matter. It was a complex social contract that defined and justified the violent hierarchies themselves. Speaking of codes of honor, the brutal demands of ancient warfare also profoundly influenced cultural values, molding society's relationships with violence, death, and identity. In many early civilizations, the act of killing, dying, and even surrender was steeped in ritual. Death in battle became a revered, almost sacred event. This was not mere glorification, but a coping mechanism. When death was a constant companion, societies invented elaborate ways to make it meaningful. The Greek idea of kalos, or noble beauty in death, or the Viking funeral pyres sending warriors to Valhalla, are prime examples of this psychological armor. They transformed hair-raising savagery into something palatable, even honorable. But perhaps the most lasting imprint of this era's warfare was on technology. Ancient war was brutal, yes, but it was also a relentless engine of innovation. Every bloody defeat and narrow victory provided lessons, driving leaps forward in metallurgy, engineering, and logistics. The development of the trireme, those sleek, deadly galleys manned by skilled oarsmen, was not just naval progress. It was a revolution in speed, maneuverability, and coordination. These vessels required synchronized human effort and cutting-edge shipbuilding innovations, and they altered the very nature of Mediterranean warfare, enabling swift strikes and prolonged blockades that could starve cities into submission. On land, the brutal demands gave birth to new weapons and defensive gear that looked straight out of a fantasy novel but were terrifyingly real. The spiked mace, the reinforced cuirass, helmets with intimidating visages designed as much to terrify the enemy as protect the wearer. The relentless push for better armor and sharper weapons led to early industrial-style workshops where blacksmiths and artisans worked feverishly, sometimes under royal decree, to outfit entire armies. This wasn't artisan jewelry making. It was mass production of death tools, the era's grim equivalent to today's factories churning out fighter jets or drones. Logistics, too, evolved because battleship-sized armies need food, weapons, and coordination. Ancient commanders were as much logistics wizards as battlefield tacticians. Roads were built or maintained to move troops quickly. Supply chains stretched across mountains, deserts, and seas. No more merely gathering nearby villagers to fight. Warfare demanded a whole infrastructure. This foreshadowed the more sprawling and organized armies of later empires, where the efficiency and scale of military support could determine victory or disaster. And then there's the cultural cross-pollination that warfare unintentionally fueled. Trapped in the crucible of conflict, soldiers and commanders encountered foreign customs, ideas, and technologies that sometimes were plundered or adopted, sometimes even revered. The spread of ironworking techniques from the Hittites to the Mediterranean, or the impact of Greek colonization prompted by both trade and conquest, are testimonies to this often overlooked consequence. War was destruction, sure, but it was also a vector for exchange, the harsh tutor that forced cultures to adapt or perish. Still, it wasn't just about technology and social shifts. The brutal demands of ancient warfare embedded a certain dark worldview in many cultures that lingered long after the battles ended. Ideas about fate, divine punishment, and cosmic order often found their way into the narratives of war. Was the enemy a barbarian scourge or a test from the gods? Were victory and defeat signs of divine favor or punishment? These beliefs shaped political legitimacy and military morale, intertwining religion and warfare so tightly that rulers invoked divine right to justify endless wars. And when wars dragged on, societies often embraced fatalism or glorified their suffering in ballads and epic tales, a kind of psychological warfare of the soul. In the grand mosaic of human history, these brutal ancient wars served as both sculpture and ruin. They raised the old to forge the new, reshaping social orders by forcing adaptability and innovation, pushing technology forward in leaps fueled by necessity and a grim determination to survive. They wove violence and honor into the cultural DNA, creating myths and rituals that defined entire civilizations. This legacy cast a long shadow over the centuries that followed, setting the stage, quite literally, for conflicts on a scale and brutality that would make ancient warriors nod in grim approval or shake their heads at the new horrors. The relentless demand for blood and steel was paradoxically one of the most potent forces of progress, and one of history's most tragic ironies. Imagine standing in a tangled mess of mud and blood, the acrid scent of sweat and fear hanging heavy in the air. Around you, the clash of steel rings out like a savage symphony as warriors locked in mortal combat test their mettle against one another. In the chaos of ancient warfare, it's easy to reduce battles to sweeping strategies and grand conquests. But what about the men and women who lived and died within that chaos? The ones whose courage, desperation, and sometimes sheer lunacy turned history's greatest contests into unforgettable stories, etched in flesh and memory. Take the tale of Cleomachus, an ancient Greek warrior whose name is almost lost beneath the weight of history's larger figures, but whose last stand at the Battle of Delium reveals the raw human drama behind the phalanx formations and battle cries. Ancient accounts say Cleomachus was initially an outsider, a mercenary called into the fray during the Peloponnesian War. When his troops wavered, he charged headlong into the enemy lines with a wild cry, his xiphos flashing like lightning. The sight apparently inspired his compatriots to rally, but it was his death that sealed the moment, a brutal, vivid reminder that sometimes the spark of one man's courage could shift the tide of a battle, even if just for a moment. And then there's the chilling legend from the watery trenches of the ancient Mediterranean, where galleys churned black seas like hungry beasts. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was not just a clash of empires. It was a gladiatorial spectacle played out on narrow decks slick with blood and salt water. Accounts whisper of an Egyptian queen, Cleopatra herself, outfitting her rowers with extra stakes to ram enemy ships, a grim innovation in naval warfare. One admiral, Marcus Agrippa, reportedly took delight in the chaos. He prowled the decks of captured vessels, demanding surrender with a grin that suggested he knew every sailor's death was only a stroke away. In a world where a single arrow through an ore carrier's chest could doom an entire galley to the depths, survival was a cruel lottery decided by skill and often by luck or lack thereof. But what about warriors who chose death on their own terms? The samurai of feudal Japan didn't just wield swords. They embraced a brutal code that demanded honor even in defeat. Seppuku, ritual suicide, was no mere act of surrender. It was a defiant statement, a final blade through the heart of shame. Legends tell of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a warrior whose brilliance on the battlefield was unmatched, yet even he faced betrayal. Facing capture, he supposedly prepared himself meticulously for self-disembowelment, ensuring his second would end his suffering quickly. It's hard to imagine the stoic calm, mixed with fierce pride, required to slice into one's own belly amid the echoes of battle. This wasn't just about death. It was about reclaiming agency in a world where failure could erase everything. The human element of ancient warfare also plays out in the micro moments, those slivers of time when a soldier's fate hangs by a thread. Like the Roman gladiator Spartacus, before he led a famous slave revolt, many gladiators began as unwilling participants thrust into the blood-soaked sands of the arena. Their struggles straddled the line between survival and spectacle. Some accounts describe gladiators who managed to turn the brutal games into personal theater, dazzling crowds with feats of strength, cunning, and sheer willpower. When the thumbs down came, it was more than a sentence. It was an echo of society's judgment, a final spotlight on a life shaped by chains and chance. And then there's the brutal business of ancient siege warfare, where the most harrowing stories abound, not just on the battlefield, but in the trenches, tunnels, and burnt-out cities. Imagine the desperate defenders of Carthage during Rome's final siege, facing starvation and betrayal while the Roman legions hammered their walls. Accounts suggest that when all hope was lost, families made harrowing decisions. Fathers pushed sons into the flames of falling homes rather than let the enemy claim them. These moments might sound unbearably dark, and they are, but they illuminate the extent to which the ancient world demanded sacrifice, not just from soldiers, but from entire communities ripped apart by war. Even the simplest weapons carry stories, like the spear of Cuchulainn, the legendary Irish hero said to fight with a mighty weapon that seethed with supernatural energy. According to the myth, the spear could predict death, glowing ominously before striking down its victim. Whether pure legend or rooted in some forgotten ritual, these tales affirm that ancient warfare was as much about the myths warriors told themselves to keep fear at bay as about the steel and stone clashing beneath their feet. In the end, what binds all these dramatic stories, from Cleomachus's feisty last charge to the grim resolve of those choosing seppuku, is the brutal reality that ancient warfare was never some distant, sanitized chess game. It was a blood-soaked, heart-pounding nightmare where every second could be your last, and every choice, fight, flee, or die, carried the weight of survival and honor intertwined. These personal accounts and legends remind us that history's great conflicts were, at their core, stories about people who loved, hated, feared, and fought with a ferocity that still echoes across millennia. So, next time you think of ancient warriors, don't just picture endless columns of marching soldiers or sprawling maps dotted with battles. Think of the men and women gripping sweat-slicked blades with shaking hands, the admiral screaming orders as his galley lists, the samurai clutching a dagger moments from a final, defiant breath. Because behind every sword thrust or ship rammed lies a human story, vivid, brutal, and utterly unforgettable. As the dust settles on battlefields long buried beneath centuries of earth and legend, what remains is more than just bones and rusted steel. It's the raw, unfiltered truth of ancient warfare, a brutal, relentless force that shaped not just nations, but the very soul of humanity. Swords clashed with a violence that echoed across valleys. Galleys sliced through brutal waves, propelled by the desperate oarsmen locked in a grim contest of speed, stamina, and sheer will. And in the quiet moments, when defeat loomed like an unforgiving specter, there was seppuku, the ultimate act of control in a world where life itself was often a reckless gamble. Look at these images etched into history. The gleaming blade that cut through armor and flesh alike was no mere weapon. It was a symbol of honor, terror, and survival. Warriors wielded their swords not just to kill, but to proclaim identity, to carve their stories into the annals of time with every stroke. But beneath the gleam was a savage reality, a life dictated by the edge of a sword, where any hesitation could mean a gruesome death. And yet, many returned to that life, drawn like moths to a flame that promised glory amid the carnage. Then there were the galleys, the warships of antiquity, stripped of anything superfluous, their wooden hulls groaning with the weight of hundreds of rowers chained to their benches, muscles screaming for relief as their hands pushed tirelessly against the unforgiving oars. This was human power at its most visceral. No engine, no sails, just raw human strength and willpower, channeled into a deadly dance on the water. Imagine being one of those oarsmen, deafened by the roar of battle horns and the crash of clashing steel above, trapped below deck, or crammed in close quarters, lungs burning with salt air and fury. Every pull was a desperate bid for survival, every race to the enemy fleet a fight against exhaustion and death. And then there's seppuku, the ritual suicide that to the outsider may seem morbid or archaic, but within the culture that birthed it, it was profoundly human, a final statement of honor and agency in a world often ruled by chance and cruelty. To plunge a blade into oneself was to reject shame and capture a fleeting moment of dignity amid chaos. Often, it was a grim alternative to capture and torture, or a way to restore one's name after disgrace. The image of the samurai calmly committing this act on the damp tatami mats cuts deeper than any sword ever could. It forces us to confront the harrowing choices individuals made in times when the world had no room for mercy. What ties these elements together across cultures, geographies, and eras is the savage demand ancient warfare placed on those who lived by it. It was a system that tolerated no weakness, no hesitation, no softening of the edges. Men marched into hell with swords drawn. Oarsmen were bound by chains of desperation, and warriors chose death over dishonor. These were not mere casualties of history. They were participants in a brutal theater where survival was a constant struggle, and sacrifice was the currency of existence. Yet, fast forward to today, and how often do we romanticize these brutal customs? Think about it. Blockbusters turn these warriors into cinematic heroes with gleaming swords that barely nick an opponent, while the grueling roar of galley rowers is sometimes into inspirational montages. Seppuku is sometimes misunderstood or trivialized, packaged as an exotic cultural quirk rather than recognized for the profound psychological and societal pressures it embodied. But underneath the layers of myth and spectacle lies a stark reality. The echoes of these demands still reverberate in the modern world. The relentless pressure to perform, to uphold reputation at any cost, the sheer physical and mental toll of conflict. It all persists in different yet hauntingly familiar forms. One might see it in the corporate gladiators who fight their battles in boardrooms rather than on fields, or in soldiers today who, behind the technology and distancing of modern warfare, face the same echoes of desperation and sacrifice that governed ancient times. There's a peculiar resilience that threads through all these stories, the kind of resilience born not from comfort or ease, but from sheer necessity. To live by the sword, operate the galley, or accept seppuku was to embrace a world without guarantees, where every day demanded more than ordinary people could bear. Their struggles demand our recognition not as relics of a brutal past, but as profound illustrations of human endurance and complexity. This reflection invites us to honor those unnamed souls who stood at the razor's edge of life and death, caught in the unforgiving tides of history. They remind us that beneath every legend of glory there was unrelenting hardship. Behind every heroic saga, countless silent sacrifices. Their stories underscore the paradox of warfare, not just its capacity for destruction, but its ability to reveal the deepest extremes of human courage and frailty. So, as we close this chapter on swords, galleys, and seppuku, it becomes clear that ancient warfare was no mere backdrop for heroic tales. It was a crucible that forged identities and destinies, shaped ideologies, and echoed through generations in forms both terrifying and telling. The brutality of the past is not a distant shadow, but an ever-present echo, reminding us to measure how we confront conflict, sacrifice, and honor in our own lives. In the end, understanding these savage demands deepens our grasp of what it means to endure and resist, to fight and fall, and sometimes to choose death over dishonor. It challenges us to appreciate the weight carried by every individual who ever lived by the sword, manned the galley, or faced the solemn blade of seppuku. Their stories are written into the marrow of history, reminders of a world where life was precious not just for its fragility, but for the strength it demanded. And maybe, just maybe, remembering them helps us navigate the battles we face today, armed not with swords or oars, but with something more elusive: wisdom, empathy, and the hope that the brutal lessons of the past can guide us to a better future.